If you are interested in understanding how race shapes the experiences of young people in schools and in the workplace, and how we can foster better conversations around it, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be covering Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we are diving into what I believe to be a very thought-provoking and a very informative book that helps to explore the psychology of racism and just the development of racial identity and the importance of open conversations about race in schools and beyond, in the workplace and in college and just in society as a whole. Just as a little background, Beverly Daniel Tatum is actually a clinical psychologist. And so she is, and she's also the former president of Spelman College. And so in her book, she actually is tackling this question from a variety of perspectives. And she is, of course, trying to help educators and parents to really answer some questions that I'm sure they have pondered, particularly about understanding and contemplating and having conversations about race. And so for that reason, Tatum's approach is, part psychology, per her background, also part education and a part sociology, as she is trying to deal with society as a whole. And so that makes this what I believe to be a very well-rounded book and a very, well-rounded exploration of race and identity and really systemic racism in the United States. The book is actually split into two different sections. So first, you start with how children begin to notice race from a young age, and then how racial identity is developed, through adolescence. And she uses a fair amount of stories to do so, just some personal anecdotes, and then just other people's anecdotes. But then she also backs it up with data, which I think is one of the big strong suits of this whole book. And so, this makes it so that probably the greatest strength of the whole book is to break down complicated psychological concepts into a very digestible approach. I would say that even though this book is kind of long, one of its greatest strengths is that even as complicated as a topic as she's covering, it is quite digestible. And so if you're having reservations about whether you think this is a book for you, I will say that if you're on the fence, know this, that it's easy to read. And I think that could help you decide whether you think this is a book you might want to take on or not. And of course, in doing so, she is trying to explain why it is exactly that Black students congregate, particularly at lunch tables. I mean, at least that's the main reference point, hence the name of the book, but really just in general, what is it that causes a sense of camaraderie and a sense of security that can only be felt with other fellow Black students and not be felt in a larger society, or what kinds of impediments there might be to that. It's not about exclusion necessarily, but it's actually more about a shared experience and just this need to affirm identity in the world that, I think there's a great deal of evidence to demonstrate how it has misunderstood or it has marginalized many people, but particularly Black youth. Of course, what I appreciated most is that Tatum, she doesn't just highlight the challenges that are being faced by Black students, but she also provides really thoughtful and just really profound insights and advice on how to engage in meaningful conversations about race, both in the classroom, but also as a society as a whole. So, conversations at home, over the dinner table, and places like that. And she really emphasizes the need for white people to confront their own racial identity, and in so doing, hopefully be part of the solution. And I will admit that that is probably going to be one of the things that is going to trouble most people that are not open to a conversation about race, particularly systemic racism. I think that that's going to be the thing that most people have a hard time really engaging with, especially if you are part of the majority in a culture. It's something you don't think about, therefore you think any conversation about it is counterproductive, or it is in some way undermining. Well, I'm not sure what you might think it is undermining, but it can certainly lead you to be closed off to some of the important conversations about race. And I think she does a really good job at helping to explain why you would need to have that conversations and approaches to doing so. The original book was published in 1997. This one is published in 2017, so this is a 20-year anniversary, which is great because I say a lot has happened in those 20 years, and I think she does a pretty good job of including additional information, although I haven't read the 1997 version, but there were certainly up-to-date references that I think went a long way into making this not just a valuable read, but possibly a valuable reread if you've only read the earlier version. And like I said, her writing is very clear, it's very accessible, and even though the subject matter can be very complex, I think it is a great read for anyone that wants to dig into the question of systemic racism and how we can make schools more inclusive spaces. And then beyond that, what criticisms would I have of this book? Probably the biggest one is simply the size of it. I mean, I at no point was I bored reading this. At no point did I feel like it was overly repetitive, but I certainly did feel that it was a long book. And that's fine. I think that she used that space well. And at no point did I think, oh, this was not a necessary part of this conversation. I will say that she does certainly go beyond the classroom. So if you are hoping exclusively for answers for within the classroom, that's not going to be in this book, which makes sense because there's no way that our questions and issues around racism are going to be exclusively within the classroom. And I don't think it's fair on schools to be expected to solve that, but it's certainly a valuable access point that she uses. And so I would say that that is definitely the key part of the book, but it is not the entirety of the book. And I think that's one of the things that makes this a slightly longer book than most people would expect. But as a whole, it is incredibly well written. And maybe, this is not my criticism, but maybe people might be critical of how digestible and accessible she makes some topics. Maybe some people feel like she is not giving enough information for a really complicated situation, or maybe she's just making it a little too easy to understand. That could possibly be an issue. I didn't personally notice any of that while I was reading it, but that could be something that someone else takes an issue with. So who would I say that this book is for? Well, there is the obvious caveat that, I mean, it's a very powerful and an accessible book that helps to shed light on the importance of racial identity and psychology of race in America's educational system and, again, in society as a whole. And so this book is really only going to be for people who want to better understand what causes us as a society to segregate ourselves. If you're just curious about an exploration of what it's like to be a minority, especially a Black American, and it is for those that are ready to accept evidence that clearly demonstrates systemic racism. If you're someone who is committed to engaging in meaningful conversations about race, or if you're an educator or a parent or a community leader wanting to create more inclusive spaces, this I think is a very valuable resource and a very good read for you. The flip side of that is, who is this book not for? Well, it's not going to be for everyone. If you're not ready to invest in reading a book of this length and a book of this depth on race in America, you might find it overwhelming. I mean, Tatum certainly dives into complex issues, and the book requires patience and certainly requires an openness to difficult truths if this is something you have not already found yourself contemplating and finding yourself trying to have a better understanding of. Additionally, if you're closed off to conversations about race, or if you're uncomfortable with exploring the concept of systemic racism, this book might challenge your worldview in ways that you might not be prepared for, or you may just outright reject, I think, a good deal of evidence that is being presented. And it certainly doesn't shy away from, laying out that evidence. And so if you're unwilling to engage with those conversations, you probably really will not appreciate the insights that this book has to offer. However, if you do not fall in that camp, and you're willing to read this much, I think it is a very good read. I think it's very digestible, and I think she does a great job at balancing anecdotes with real data, with just thoughtful insights. And so that would be who I would generally encourage to read this book. But I would love to hear what other people have to say about this book, or maybe you have another suggestion of books in this same category or this same genre, maybe a counter to this that maybe gives a different approach to understanding issues like this. But please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.